content for tonight. As I said, we're going to get into this idea of working with big ideas. So let me share my PowerPoint. And for those of you that have presented, I have created a link in Canvas for you to upload your presentation. So please do that.
Do just one of us upload it, or do several? I mean, both of us need to upload it.
As long as both of your names are clearly marked on the presentation, just one of you can upload it, and I'll connect the dots. Okay, so let me get this PowerPoint in the right frame here. So we're talking about teachers and teaching and working with big ideas. And the first thing I want to share is I actually saw this on social media today. There's been a lot of criticism of the national media as they've been talking about this hurricane that was supposed to be blowing through my house right now. And fortunately for me, moved a little bit eastward. And so we haven't even had rain today, if you can believe that. It's just been a little breezy. But anyway, there was a big report that came out that the hurricane was going to hit somewhere between New Orleans and Mobile. And a lot of people were reminded of the time that Mississippi was referred to as the landmass, right? And so here's you a geography lesson about Mississippi. And so you have French Mississippi to the left of actual Mississippi. You've got Supply and Logistics Depot, Mississippi, up there to the left. You've got Hilly Mississippi above, Bizarre Mississippi to the right, Rich Mississippi just a further bit to the east, Old Mississippi, Basketball Mississippi, and Vacation Mississippi. So it is all Mississippi, including the actually still Mississippi part right there. So anyway, just a little bit of humor because we're often forgotten. I was actually in a conversation today with somebody from Florida, and they had no idea that hurricanes typically came to Mississippi. And I was like, there was this big one called Katrina that, in fact, did not hit New Orleans like most people think. It actually made landfall on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So I actually had a neat experience after Katrina. At the time, I was working for a church, and our church got involved in these relief efforts for people on the coast. And what was happening is our church kind of served as a distribution center, and there'd be all these big trucks would come in with all these supplies. And then we would actually load them on these smaller trailers and take them down to these sites on the coast to distribute. And one of the trips that I went on, we went down to Poplarville, Mississippi, and we're at this National Guard armory delivering the stuff that's being distributed to people. So you've got people going through kind of a line, picking up the things that they need to take home. And while we were there, all of a sudden these jets just like over above us and then started circling around above us, and then all of a sudden took off. And I was standing by this person with the National Guard, and I asked, what is that? And she said something to the effect of, I can't comment on that. And about that time, in the field next to the building, Marine One landed, and the president was coming to visit Poplarville, Mississippi. So that was interesting. I also saw a video this week in all this conversation about the Twin Towers and the attack there. It was a guy interviewing a guy who was having a remembrance of that time. And this was one of those reporters that's not really a real news reporter. They're more of a satire, humor type reporter. And he had gone into this crowd of people to ask questions of people. And this one guy was really upset with Barack Obama because he was not in the White House in the Oval Office when the Twin Towers were attacked. And the interviewer, kind of went on and had him talk about that. Do you guys all understand why Barack Obama would not have been in the Oval Office when the Twin Towers fell? Yeah, because he was not the president of the United States at that time frame. So it's important for us to kind of learn history and to understand things, because it, unfortunately, guys, at least for that person, influences his entire worldview because he has an erroneous remembrance and perspective about things. So, um, anyway, so after doing the last week's module, I have a few questions for you. What is the relationship between disciplines, themes, concepts, and processes? I'd like for one of you to kind of take a stab at that and kind of share with us what you think are the differences between those different ideas.
Disciplines are the areas of study that you're going to focus on, such as geography, history,
Right.
economics. Themes are the units that you're going to focus on. If you're going to focus on culture, if you're going to focus on, I guess diversity would be a theme.
That could be a thing, yeah.
If you're going to focus on, let's say, like I said, economics, I can't think of a word for it, but themes are what you're going to teach. That's what I want to say.
Right. So connecting ideas around some kind of central topic. Right.
Yes. Concepts and processes, I would want to say this was a hard one for me in the lesson, but a concept is more so the ideas that you're teaching.
Okay. It's the way you're expressing some complex ideas. Very good.
Right. And processes, what you're going to use to express those ideas.
Yeah, so processes really are more about doing the act of social studies, being a historian, being an economist, that kind of thing. Very, very good. So, how do these disciplines, themes, concepts, and processes help you to plan some content rich social studies units and lessons? How do they help? Somebody else want to take a stab at that? I mean, I can sit here all night. Somebody can comment on it. How do these ideas help us when we're thinking about developing a unit or a lesson?
I think it's break each piece down into smaller sections so that we can go into more detail. I mean, as with anything, if you plan, it's going to be anything's going to be richer if you plan.
Right. And so these just kind of help you to kind of put some a framework on the different aspects that you need to make sure you're including in that lesson or that unit. So you're going to obviously address multiple disciplines. If you're talking about a social studies concept, it's really difficult to talk about, for example, history without getting into some of the political impact of that, into some of the economic impact of that. Certainly geography stands, very supreme because where we are in the world, and where we are in relationship to other peoples in the world really impacts our experience in the world. And then also breaking it down into the different aspects of it, like focusing on processes is a very different thing than concepts. Concepts are those ideas and that way that we're kind of expressing those ideas, but then processes are more about the how do we work with those ideas. So it's important that we make sure we're considering all these different layers. What of anything from the last module, it says organizing or teaching strategies. What do you plan to apply to your own teaching in the future based off of your experience with that particular module?
I would like to apply thematic units because I saw how you can integrate different subjects in one unit and you can still teach math, you can still teach reading, you can still teach science and social studies, but focus on in one area.
Absolutely. And those connections that happen in those themes calls for more strength in your students' understanding because they're making more firm, how do I say this? It's, I don't know if you guys know this, but when you're making a concrete foundation for a house, okay, when they're pouring that concrete, they put within it this wire mesh, okay, and it goes like all different ways, and the wires have all these connecting points, and then that wire mesh hardens within the concrete. It's all of those connecting points of the wire that holds the concrete together and prevents it from cracking and breaking apart and splitting off. My neighbor, just a couple of houses down, had a broken part of their driveway, the concrete driveway, and they just went in and put a board, took out the old concrete, filled in the hole where it was there on the side, and within like a week or two it just like broke right back off again, and it was because they didn't have any of the wire in there connecting it to the rest of the driveway to hold it there in place. And so that's what that thematic connection does, is it really creates that undergirding and that strength so that as students are beginning to understand concepts, they're really having a firm understanding of those concepts. Very good thoughts. So we want to do a little bit of review. And the way that we're going to do this review is we're going to try to break you out into groups. WebEx has this new feature where I can send you into breakouts. And we're just going to try it out to see if it works. So I'm about to try to break you guys out into 3 groups. Group 1 is going to go back and review pages 61 through 67. So if you got a piece of paper, write down to your side there, pages 61 through 67 next to the number 1. And so that group is just going to go back and tell us what this traditional social studies curriculum looks like. I don't know what group you're going to be in, so you're going to need to take a note so I can tell you once I get into the breakout if you're going to be 1, 2, or 3. So number 1 is page 61 through 67, that traditional social studies curriculum. Number 2 is pages 67 through 64, and you're just identifying those threads in social studies and how they relate to this idea of rich ideas. And then group 3 is going to be pages 75 through 79, and that is, you're going to talk about how much latitude teachers have in making curriculum choices, okay? So I'm going to stop sharing this so that, well, maybe I don't have to stop sharing. Let me see. I'm going to break you into 3 sessions and create assignments. And I'm about to start. So hopefully you'll get into a session and I'll be able to find you and then bring you back. But this is my first time to do this, guys. All right, everybody, welcome back. we can get a volunteer from group 1 to please share the answer to your question, what does the traditional social studies curriculum look like?
Okay, so I didn't get to finish reading all of it, but I do have some.
Okay.
In the traditional setting, teachers use a curriculum guide. This guide tells teachers what broad content areas they're responsible for, which is the scope, and in what order they should be presented, which is the sequence. In this curriculum, there is only one focus per grade. For example, in kindergarten itself, which is him or herself, and they focus on the most immediate environment. And in first grade, it's the family, which is the similarities and differences across families. And so I kind of thought that was strange how they have it set up to where in each grade they only focus on one scope or one topic rather than exploring different topics. They mainly just focus on one. And then this advanced curriculum sequence is made by a theorist named Paul Hanna. It is called the expanding communities model because the curriculum gradually expands outward. Hanna based his curriculum on two principles. One involved the assumption that children learn best when they deal with ideas known to them or related to experience, and then gradually move to unknown experiences. His second belief is that students need to move from concrete to abstract thinking. This means that he believes that students are more comfortable with tangible ideas than dealing with conceptual matters. That's kind of where I stopped, but I kept reading some before I could type out any more. And a lot of people find this really contradicting because some things that are found in research say that children do actually have those concrete and abstract thinking skills when they are younger. And it says right here that according to Hanna's scheme, these youngsters should be able to understand world's culture, a subject that is typically reserved for grade 6. So his kind of concept contradicts what he's saying because he's saying that these kids don't have the ability to think concrete and abstractly yet, but then again they're learning stuff that should be at a 6th grade level.
Yeah. So what's happening is that Hannah's taking Piaget's theory that is broken out into stages, and he's saying that pre-operational learners, which are preschoolers, and concrete operational thinkers, who are our typical early school age, have not gotten into formal operations to where they're able to understand abstract concepts on the purely abstract plane. And so understanding something like the world and countries in the world and all that kind of thing should be beyond what these younger children are able to understand. So his ideas are based in research, but more contemporary research that has investigated Piaget's theory has not disproven Piaget's theory. There still is that kind of qualitative shift in the way that young children think versus middle grade children versus older children and adults. The thing, though, that Hanna didn't understand, and what a lot of other people, frankly, did not understand, is that we can help make those things that are more abstract accessible to younger learners by making them connected to more concrete type things. So if I'm going to teach about cultures of the world, then I need to start like thinking about, let's bring in some food and cook meals from those different cultures in the world. Let's bring in and see examples of how people dress in different cultures of the world. Let's bring in real kind of objects that are concrete that help make those more abstract concepts more accessible. The other thing is that whole idea of preschoolers being egocentric in their thinking and only being able to think about themselves. And that's why that first part focuses on self and then moves to family, then neighborhood. There's some reality there about, things that we have prior knowledge about and understanding are the things that we can really build knowledge on. It's just the process can work a lot more quickly than what Hanna really kind of understood. Just a quick question. If you look at the state standards in Mississippi for social studies, is it based on the Expanding Horizons approach? Guys, it really is. It's based off of, a lot of the standards out there are based off of this Expanding Horizons. So that presents us with a conundrum as you're trying to plan out your instruction, because you're going to have to address the standards, but you're also going to have to expand well beyond the standards, particularly in those early grades, due to how restricting they can possibly be. Did somebody have a comment? Okay, so I need a representative from group 2. What are the threads of social studies and how do they relate to the notion of teaching rich ideas?
All right. The threads were the geographic, political, economic, sociocultural, and global.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we understood it was kind of like the same like thematic approach to teaching, and that like when students understand it better if you give them connections between all of it and real world instead of just one subject per se or one theme. On page 72, it had a reflection and it says a rich social studies curriculum lies in the connections you help students make between ideas and questions. So we come up that we thought that the reason that the way it relates to the teaching rich ideas is that they get say more information out of teaching it all together and making connections with it all instead of just teaching one subject at a time. I mean, we didn't have as much as Kristen did. Sorry.
Well, I mean, that's perfectly fine. The thing that I want to point out to you guys is that, the presentation you guys did today on the history of all these places, the part where it really became more interesting to me was when you brought in the impact on more modern day things like the 9/11 thing, when you brought in some geographic representation alongside the history, or maybe somehow how it impacted political ideas. Anytime that you had some convergence of the different threads, frankly, the presentation just became more interesting at those points. And that's really what we need to try to get to with our instruction in social studies, to where we're looking at the content that we're teaching in terms of, like you to use your words, making it more real world. Like, the real world doesn't exist just as a history strand, right? There's economic, geographic, political, sociocultural, and global issues across all things that we encounter in our world. And as we are able to kind of integrate those threads, we weave together a stronger understanding in our students. So somebody from group 3, how much latitude do teachers have in making curriculum choices? Who's our rep from group 3?
Okay, if we understood it correctly, I guess the way I interpret it is how much input teachers have in the social studies
Absolutely.
lesson in the curriculum. So, from what we read in the book, it says that a lot of teachers, basically because of the curriculum, they fall prey to seductive temptation to slavishly follow the curriculum guide and to teach social studies as if it were a set of simple topics of this vast, this big, broad subject is just a set of simple topics, and students are basically memorizing facts instead of actually getting their own perspective on something. They're memorizing facts and just enough to take the test and pass the test. That's basically what it is. And how much input can teachers have to help students stop memorizing facts and, to share ideas and share different perspectives of students and their learning. And it says, I read somewhere here where it says children have the opportunity to bring their ideas and perspectives and evidence to this change in knowledge table as well. And it says that this doesn't mean that teachers need to accept as valid all the ideas students hold or construct. But teachers should take the students' ideas and opinions. Let me see, it's something else I had, but I kind of lost my spot.
To help you out, Maquita, it says that the teachers have the latitude to choose. We have a great influence to choose because the way the curriculum is made is more of a step by step, and if you follow it, we don't have a lot of the material sometimes to teach it. So we have to be creative to teach it in a manner. And school districts also give teachers the ability to go ahead and, how would I say, it, put your own spin on it instead of teaching it word by word from the curriculum.
Right. Let's think about this. Teachers give into pressure from standardized tests, right? They give into pressure of, well, the curriculum guide says I've got to cover this, and this is when I've got to cover it. Teachers give into pressure of, well, this textbook says that I should be covering this particular piece of content, so I should be covering it. One of the things that you should be asking yourself as a social studies teacher is, who came up with all this stuff? Like, who came up with these facts? Are these facts in the textbook even accurate facts? Are they lacking some kind of perspective that they really should have brought to the table? Unfortunately, our social studies textbooks typically are written by people that look like me, white guys, with a little bit of gray coming in, right? And so that by nature of that fact, you end up with textbooks that represent a very narrow perspective. And there's so much richness out there in the world that we could be learning about in varied perspectives. The other thing to consider is the people that wrote the standards, right? Or the curriculum guide. Again, there were people like me, like you, a teacher at a school, invited to a committee. The committee got together and they decided these are the concepts that need to be taught in 6th grade, and this is kind of the order that they need to be done in. And honestly, those people in that group that put that all together, they had grand goals, and it's not like they have a nefarious plot to, ruin children's lives or anything like that. But what they didn't really consider is, what is it like in that real classroom? What did that particular group of students bring to the table in terms of their prior knowledge, their prior experiences, their interests? What did you bring to the table as a teacher? We're doing all this social studies content to remind us of all these things that we could possibly need to teach in social studies. But guys, there's going to be parts of it that just resonate better with you. There's going to be like U.S. history, getting into presidential history, all that kind of stuff. I can teach that stuff. I get excited about that stuff. Teaching about the Byzantine Empire, I'm going to have to put on a show and act like I'm interested in it, because I really have to go back and study and become interested in it to really bring that conveyance of how important it is. The point being, you're going to go into a classroom and you're going to have to make some professional judgment about the content that you are going to include in your class. And that's going to be based off of what your students bring to the table, what you bring to the table, some big ideas that you're going to want to discuss that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes, and then also the amount of time, frankly, that you have to cover all of that in. Let me go back and share the PowerPoint again. So earlier in the chat, I gave you an assignment for a part. So I would like for everybody to go back and look at that chat. It's a little bit back now because we've made some comments. If you'll go back and see who you were assigned to read for, I'd like for us to turn to page 82 in the textbook, and we're going to read this vignette here about Sandra Prosey and her 5th grade social studies instruction. Has everybody found their part that they've been assigned to? I didn't assign everybody. I was just using who was on my screen at that particular time. Okay, Krista's on the phone. Did I assign her a part? Krista is supposed to read Michelle. Krista, are you with us? Can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay. Good deal. Let me read the parts just so that everybody knows. Let me get back to it. Prosey's Kristen. Angela is Marquita. And it just moved, so I'm having to go back again. Rashawn is Peyton, Michael Stephanie, Dion is Tasha, Michelle is Krista, Tom is Blair, Whitney is Brenda, and Rochelle is Destiny. Okay? So, Kristen, you'll actually start there on page 82.
Okay. Now,
Yeah.
what kind of government do you think we will talk about?
Public schools.
Maybe I should unmute my mic. Public schools.
Okay. Now who's Rashana? I'll say city to fill that in.
Who runs the
The mayor.
do I read what I'm doing?
Prosy writes city on the board and asks, who is the mayor? A girl calls out, Luciano. Prosy nods and writes Luciano on the board. What other kinds of government are there? What other areas need to be run? She asks.
Community.
Oh, I didn't assign Tina. State.
Yes, what state?
New York.
Who runs our state?
The governor.
Prosy nods and writes state, governor, and Cuomo, the current New York governor, on the board. As she does, a boy calls out, what about county? Prosy says, well, yes, but I'm looking for something that starts with an F. The girl guesses federal. Prosy responds, right. And who runs the federal government? The boy offers Rush Limbaugh, while the rest of the class shouts Barack Obama. The next day, Prosy begins class by distributing a worksheet entitled The Government of the United States. She gives the children 8 minutes to complete it, instructing them to write in cursive only. The remainder of the class is spent reviewing the worksheet questions.
The bank is the head of the executive branch.
The president.
The courts are in the blank branch.
Judicial.
The president takes the oath of office on January 20th. This is called blank day.
Memorial Day.
Independence Day.
It's called inauguration day. During his years in office, the president lives in the blank.
The White House. Okay, so what does Prosy seem to consider important about the subject matter of the U.S. government?
Authority.
What is the, okay, so the authority structure, right? What view of learners does she seem to uphold?
Can you explain the question maybe a little more?
Well, we talked about learning and learners in a previous module. So we talked about how, certain teachers kind of ignore the fact that students bring things to the table. Do you think that that she views learners as contributors to the conversation or just buckets to be filled?
I kind of feel like she contributed everybody. She was asking them questions.
Okay, what kind of questions did she ask?
They weren't very I'm trying to think of the word. Descriptive questions. Like she didn't ask for much input. They were more like fill in the blank questions. Like she wasn't trying to get their input and feedback to start discussions. And I kind of believe that that's the basis of social studies, is to have that discussion and have those conversations to get more in depth about it.
So it really, if you look at her lesson, it's very much based on facts, right? And I mean, it says explicitly that she has them fill out this worksheet, but even her conversation with them is really the filling in of a worksheet. It's not paper, but she's asking a question and they're given a single answer, and it's either right or wrong.
They're
Correct?
very bland.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to listen to an account of Janice Mead. And I failed to mention that Sandra was a middle-aged European American, and she had 21 students in her class who were predominantly African American. Janice's class, she's a white middle-aged teacher too. She teaches fourth grade at a largely white upscale suburban elementary school. She's also different than Prosy in that she uses trade books in addition to the standard textbook. She often groups learners in various ways to work on assignments. So this is her account. On the second day of the unit on American slavery, Mead introduces the Underground Railroad. After a brief recap of the previous day's discussion, she explains, now we're going to learn some more facts. She distributes copies of the trade book If You Traveled on the Underground Railroad. Mead announces, I'm going to give each person a question, and it's going to be that person's job to read the question on the appropriate page and come up with the important points. Continuing, she says, now you should write your important points on a piece of paper or an index card to help you remember. When we're back together as a class, we're going to review the questions, and you're all going to give us the answers. You're going to be the expert on that question. Although each learner is responsible for one question, Mead organizes the class so that students can work in pairs. She urges them to read the relevant information a few times and to tell your partner the answer to your question, how you would explain it. Mead allows the class 20 minutes to read the text, make notes in response to their questions, and talk with their partners. She calls the class to order and asks Larry to read his question. How did the Underground Railroad get its name? And to give his answer, Larry says, there was once a runaway slave. He escaped in 1831 and swam in the river to a city in Ohio. His owner searched for him, but he couldn't be found. His owner thought he must have escaped on an underground railroad. And that's how the Underground Railroad got its name. Mead thanks Larry and explains, okay, the owner was bewildered because he was so close to him. He knew the slave had to be there somewhere, but he couldn't see him. So the name Underground Railroad seemed to stick. Underground because it was secret, and railroad because people on it seemed to move so fast and it was difficult to catch them. Class continues with learners giving their responses to questions such as, what did it mean to be a slave? Why did slaves want to leave their masters? And where would escaping slaves go first? What dangers did escaping slaves face? And what did the fugitive slave law say? And how did slaves hear about Canada and freedom? So how does Mead approach her subject matter differently than Prosy?
There was a lot more discussion. They were allowed to kind of put in what they gathered from the text rather than just filling in blanks. Something that I did notice though is she focused on facts. Like whenever she was explaining for them to do, she told him then to pick out key points. And Larry's answer was a lot different in her answer in the sense of her answer kind of gave a background to the Underground Railroad, and Larry's answer gave more facts about it.
Okay. So, who's better? If you had to be in Prosy's class or Mead's class, which one would you want to be in?
Mead.
Mead's. Okay, so she's dealing more around concepts. She's getting beyond just simple facts. She's engaging the students in some conversations. Something could be said about how she perceives her students, because she does perceive them as being able to do some investigation and some contribution. But as Kristen has pointed out, she's still kind of stuck in just kind of regurgitating the facts, right? Like they're reading some text, they're finding some information, and then they're sharing it back. And while that's better than just kind of being asked these questions, the blank is the head of the executive branch, and fill in the blank right or wrong, and then be corrected by the teacher. She's still doing a little bit of that correcting. You'll notice that after Larry shared his thing, her response wasn't, yes, that's right or wrong, like the first person did, but she went into and gave further explanation about why it was called the Underground Railroad. So you still have kind of this teacher conveying knowledge to the students. She's really kind of meeting them halfway. She's like having them find part of the knowledge, and then she's meeting them and giving them more knowledge. So let's listen to this next account. And this is Pam Durson. She's a European American in her 40s, 20-year veteran whose experience has been in suburban schools with predominantly white children. And these students are fourth graders. She's introducing a history unit which students will research Native Americans in Tidewater, Chesapeake region. Durson asks, how do we know what we know? Durson understands that historical knowledge is largely indeterminate because what we know is based largely on traces of the past, residual evidence with gaps and holes. She wants her learners to wrestle with this big idea as they go about researching questions on their own. Durson knows that the class will encounter numerous facts about Native life, and she wants them to know this information, but she also wants her students to become careful, systematic researchers with a skeptical, questioning edge. Wouldn't the world be better if we had more adults who were systematic researchers with a skeptical, questioning edge instead of believing everything that they read on social media? But that is me getting off track. As the class considers her question, Durson continues. Did you ever wonder how we know what we know about these Tidewater Native Americans we are studying? Have you wondered? I think about this a lot. I talk to my relatives about it too. Students volunteer several sources of information, artifacts, bones, fossils, a wagon. On this last point, Durson asked what would happen to a wagon over time. It would rot, one boy replies. Sensing a teachable moment, Durson responds, that's right. That's exactly what happens. It makes the work historians and researchers do very difficult because what's left of the past is so scarce many times, especially if the history you are studying happened a long time ago. Durson then informs the class that they are going on a scavenger hunt. She tells them to look under their desk where taped to the undersides they find different colored pieces of paper, pink, yellow, green, and white, with drawings of Native artifacts on them. Some students have one piece, others find more than one. Durson asks the children to take out a piece of notebook paper and carefully describe the nature of what they found. She draws a map of the classroom on the board and labels the rows and desks in a grid pattern with coordinates. Students spend the next 30 minutes charting the location of each piece of colored paper and what is drawn on it. Once finished, Durson explains that the grid is an example of how archaeologists map and dig a dig site in order to understand what happened there. Having piqued their interest, Durson asks her students, what can we say are the advantages and disadvantages of using artifacts to learn more about Native Americans? Louise says they help us know more about the Indians. Rudy, they tell us how they live. Durson, yes, but do they tell us everything? Take a look at this. She holds up a pottery shard and walks around the room showing it to the learners. What is it? Gina says, we don't know because it's broken. Durson, that's right. Sometimes we don't know what these things are. We have to guess. And sometimes we make mistakes. That's the problem when doing research. Often we can't be sure of the answers to our questions because what we find is not very good evidence. Having demonstrated the difficulty of interpreting bits and pieces of evidence, Durson senses her learners are now receptive to her bigger point about the interpretive nature of history and historical understanding, how we know what we know. Durson says, what we know about history changes over time. We find new things and figure out different explanations for what went on. You would think history is dead because it happened a long time ago, but it's not. It's very much alive. and it's changing all the time. That's why I like it so much. When you are doing your research, remember to be careful, check your sources. Sometimes facts aren't what they seem. So what do you notice that's different about Durson's approach to instruction?
Focus on the big idea. She's very interactive and it's student-based learning, and she uses real-life connections.
So what was her big idea? And somebody besides Kristen. Kristen's contributing a lot. So who else? What was her big idea?
Her big idea was, how do we know the history that we've heard about and that we've known throughout
How do we know
our
what we
lives?
know? How do we know what we know?
And she didn't focus on facts like the other teacher just focused on correct, this is right. You know, how did the Tidewater Chesapeake region do this correct? She actually, you know, told students that things that we have learned throughout history has changed, and some of the things that we might know could actually not be true.
Right. And so it says in here at some point that she does care about them picking up some facts along the way. And that's going to happen naturally as they're engaging in this inquiry process, okay? But what's most important to her is everything connecting back to the central idea, this big idea of how do we know what we know. And when you engage your students in these big ideas, it shifts the focus of your social studies instruction away from those discrete facts back to pointing your students towards an understanding and an answering of that question that surrounds the big idea. Now, your big idea doesn't necessarily have to be stated as a question, but oftentimes it is going to be stated as a question. And that's clearly evidenced here in this particular example. So when we're thinking about good teaching, we actually think about it in terms of this framework that David Hawkins came up with. He said that teaching is more than loving students, managing a quiet classroom, and designing fun activities. Of course, we want all those things to happen in a classroom. But what good teaching is learning. Powerful teaching and learning develop when a teacher and the learners regularly engage with big ideas, okay? So when we're thinking about good teaching, there's three components that Hawkins wants us to pay attention to. It's the I, or you could say you, thou, that's the learners, and then it, the subject matter. And so what he's saying here is that you have to, if you're going to develop powerful teaching, you're going to have to bring you and your learners to this point where they're engaging in subject matter around these kind of big ideas that, that you're bringing to your students. Teachers have for years chosen to teach in traditional ways. You guys have all talked about how you experienced that as you were coming up. And just the same way those teachers chose to teach in traditional ways, you can choose to teach differently. And that's the challenge that I'm giving you guys today, to think about how you can capture the power of big ideas to improve your instruction in social studies. Good teachers know how to manage ideas. It's not so much about just managing a classroom, and classroom management becomes an important factor. But guys, it would be more important for your classroom to be a buzz of activity, to be loud to the point that the principal comes and fusses at you guys because you're disrupting the class next door, rather than everybody sitting quietly and doing what was happening in that first scenario where you're just filling in the blanks, right? If you're going to manage ideas, you're going to have some robust conversations. You're going to have, at times, maybe some arguments about different points of view. And of course, students have to be respectful, and you have to manage that on some level. But you've got to get into your mind that the more important thing is managing these big ideas. An enormous difference exists between just keeping your students quiet and in their seats and teaching them to be thoughtful, smart, and engaged. And that's what we're trying to get to with our instruction. So good teaching, I said this, is more than just doing those fun activities. It is when you're regularly engaging your students in these big ideas. So what are the characteristics of a big idea? What do you think we have when we have a big idea? All right, Kristen, I'll let you talk again.
Question,
It's right here on the screen. What are the characteristics of a big idea?
I feel like it's a really broad question, but like in my opinion, when you think of a big idea, you have to cover so much with just one topic. Kind of like she did. She was saying how history, it's like a buildup of things in time. It gets lost in time, it rots. But in that big idea, she pulled apart pieces to contribute to that big idea. And so I feel like a big idea is the main thing that you're wanting to get across to your students while still bringing in other information.
Okay, good deal. So earlier we said, did somebody else have a comment? I'm sorry, I think I cut somebody off. Maybe not. Okay, so earlier we said concepts are a way of expressing complex ideas, right? We can also think about social studies topics, which kind of begin to sound like a big idea. So a concept, well, okay, for example, if we're thinking about a unit on our neighborhood, okay, a fact might be that you live in an urban neighborhood. So that's just one singular fact. A concept might be neighborhood, just this idea of neighborhood, right? And then a topic could be our neighborhood. So a topic could be something that you could frame a lesson around, right? And unfortunately, that's where a lot of teachers stop. What we want to do is to go to the next level, because concepts, facts, and topics are not by themselves big ideas. Big ideas help teachers decide what to teach by connecting all those facts, concepts, and topics that are within the curriculum around a central idea that we're investigating. They also help to drive the instructional approaches that you're taking, because you're trying to get to this place of addressing this bigger idea, this bigger question. And they also propel and engage your students' thinking. The big focus around the big idea is thinking around a problem or bringing about a solution, not just understanding a set of facts, concepts, or the information related to a topic. So when we're thinking about big ideas on this continuum of teaching practices, we have classrooms that are more traditional, explicit, teacher-centered, prescriptive. You've got a lecture, you've got the worksheet, the recitation like we had in the first group. On the other side of the spectrum, we have this more implicit, student-centered, and open-ended approach where you've got group work, learning centers, and journal writing. And that's more like the second example that we read in the book. And what big ideas do is they kind of blow this whole model apart. And they say, you know what? There's a time for a lecture. There's a time for a worksheet. There's a time for group work. There's a time for learning centers. There's a time for writing in our social studies instruction. And this big idea that we're investigating is really going to be the thing that drives our decisions as the teacher about what type of instruction I'm going to do at any given point during the week. So if you think back to that 5E model that we've been talking about in terms of creating your lesson plan, it is the perfect model to kind of build a lesson or a unit around a big idea. And if you think about the different stages of the 5Es, an engaging thing might be something that you do in a large group that's more teacher directed. And then as you move into the engagement piece, then you're going to have, I mean, not the engagement piece, the exploration piece, then it might turn more into learning centers or, group work or that kind of thing. So it's about picking what point you need to use a different type of instruction versus just saying, I'm going to be the student-centered teacher or I'm going to be the teacher-directed teacher. And you're going to be all of it. And the big idea is the overall umbrella that's driving what you're doing in the classroom. So some factors that you're going to have to consider as you're thinking about planning around these big ideas. Your educational goals and objectives, your standards, the curriculum guide, the curriculum materials you have, the amount of time you have to teach, and the impact of standardized tests. But guys, don't get overwhelmed by all of these factors. At the end of the day, it's more valuable for your students to have some experiences around some big ideas in social studies than it is that you covered everything on your curriculum guide. That even in terms of the standardized tests, when do we test our students on social studies in our public schools? Anybody know?
Is it 7th grade?
U.S. history. So when they get to U.S. history in high school is the real formalized time that we test them on social studies content. So guys, don't worry about the standardized test. In fact, what we know from research is if you will teach social studies content in real robust ways, it will increase the standardized testing scores of students on the ELA test that they take all the way throughout. The reason for that is when they get in there, read those pieces in there that they have to respond to, they'll have more content knowledge to base their understanding of that material on, and they'll perform better on those tests. So you're not worried about teaching to a test in social studies. You're worried about exposing students to the world so that they have a rich content background knowledge to bring to all of the other things that they're doing in their life in school. So 2 main considerations that you need to keep in mind is your knowledge of the subject matter and your knowledge of the children. And again, that's why we do this thing around the content knowledge presentations, is hopefully at least for the presentation you do, you go a little bit deeper in understanding some content that you could be teaching. But as we go through this process, it also becomes very clear that there's such a wide, vast amount of, particularly when we're going through the historical knowledge that you can encounter. And it's better if you can bring a rich content knowledge to the stuff that you're doing. So let's see what time it is.